Howdy. So as we get started, we're kind of an intimate group today. So I would love for you all to share in chat your experience with project management, formal or ad hoc, and either in or out of the areas of data science. And so my goal today is for you to understand the broad strokes of the discipline of project management, its two main methodologies, and how it might benefit data science projects. And I want to give you the vocabulary for you to do a little bit of research and reading on your own to extend your learning in project management, because we're just going to cover the basics today. My name is Dianna Morganti. I am with both the Multidisciplinary Engineering Department as well as the university libraries. I've been a librarian for 18 years now and a project management professional, that certification, for 5.5 years, about 6 years, and I've been teaching data management about that long as well. I'm not a data analyst or a data scientist, but I believe that my experience in project management and data management can help show you how one can benefit the other. So let's get started. So first, we're going to start with what is the definition of a project. And here's sort of the dictionary definition of a project from the Project Management Institute, or PMI. I'll talk about them a few times today. That's a governing body for the profession of project management. A project is a temporary endeavor undertaken to create a unique product, service, or result. So far, this fits data science really well, where we're working on a project to create a unique result, a unique thing, some unique new knowledge or information. A project has a defined beginning and end in time, and therefore a defined scope and resources. Okay. Another way to say the same thing is that a project is anything that has a defined scope, cost, and time. Scope is what you want to do, the boundaries of what you want to do. Cost, of course, is the limits of your budget, and time is the time allotted. And together, the people in project management call this the triple constraint, the three constraints of your project. And they are so important, in fact, that in some knowledge areas of project management, they actually call this the definition of a project. The scope, cost, and time is the definition of your project. Anything that you endeavor to do with a specified and unique scope, cost, and time is a project. And in fact, if you go back to that definition, here you can see I've circled the elements of the definition that are scope, a unique product, service, or result with a defined scope. And thank you for sharing your experience in project management in the chat. Those of you who haven't contributed that, please continue to as well. Here you see cost, defined resources. I'll note that that does not mean that it costs cash money. Sometimes we embark on projects where the defined budget is zero. We have no money, and that is our cost constraint, right? A constraint doesn't actually have to be a number. I mean, zero is a number as well. So we have to accomplish our scope within the budget of $0. So perhaps that means that we can't afford a fancy data analytics software. So that means that we have to spend time learning the free version. In that sense, cost affects time. And here you see time. It's temporary, and it has a defined beginning and end in time. And in fact, that interplay, the fact that changes in scope affect cost and time and vice versa, that is an important fact about project management. That's why it's called the triple constraint. It's an acknowledgement of how intimately the three pieces of a definition of a project are linked. So if you're working on a data science project, analyzing how an intervention in a classroom affects learning, but near the end of the project, you decide you want to compare this to some new variable, say the temperature in the classroom, how comfortable the students were when they were learning. Then you need to go back and either find or gather that data, adding to your time. So these three constraints are always linked in a project. So I'm going to give you a moment in the chat, type some examples of projects that meet the definition of a project. So if you type an example of one before, so somebody mentioned book digitization and projects, consider the three aspects: scope, cost, and time, and give an example of what either the scope, cost, or time is in a project that you've been a part of. So I'm going to give some silence for you all to think and type that out. It can be in data science or not in data science. While you all are typing, I'll share some general projects, project samples, right? Planning a wedding, building a house. These are common examples that I use when I'm teaching project management, because many of us have attended a wedding. We know kind of the general outline of a lot of weddings, or we've watched a building getting built. So we know general components of that kind of a project. We know kind of the scope of them, even if we're not familiar with the cost or the time on them. Mostly on funded research projects, those usually have a pretty tight budget or cost as associated to them. So thank you for sharing that. Your time may also be a very strict constraint as well. It may only be a, say, 2-year funded project or something like that. Whereas when things need to change, when changes need to happen, the scope might be what has to change, or the scope may not be able to change. And you might really be locked into all three of those triple constraint conditions. Another example that I can think of in data science that I like to use, I use it because I think it's understandable to anybody across fields, is just gathering and analyzing my annual statistics of my work. Things like my work involves teaching workshops, things like this. This is a piece of the data that I would gather at the end of the year every year. And I'm going to use this as a sample a little bit later on. Hobby research projects on the side. That's awesome. That's when maybe scope and time are a little bit more flexible, but cost might be that zero cost kind of project that we were talking about as well when you're just doing hobby research. Any grant funded project investigating something within a limited time period within a finite budget. Exactly. So thank you all for sharing that. So I'm going to move on now to talk about the two main arms of project management, or the two main methodologies of project management. There are a lot out there, but they fall under two general categories, and that is Waterfall and Agile. And I'm going to cover both so you can kind of understand how they're different and when you might choose each one. So Waterfall project management might be called traditional project management. It is largely governed by the PMI, Project Management Institute, and they document it in the PMBOK, or we pronounce that PMBOK. That stands for the Project Management Body of Knowledge, but you will hear it referred to by its acronym PMBOK. And the methodology would be called any of these terms: Waterfall, traditional, PMI, or PMBOK, but it all refers to the same thing. In Waterfall project management, projects are largely all planned ahead of time. There are a lot of dependencies. So while changes may happen, they have to really be studied and approved. How does a change in scope affect time and cost, for example? For example, if you decide at the last minute to change a wedding venue, if your project is putting on a wedding, that's going to affect many other things. You're going to have to move the caterer, have the flowers delivered somewhere else. You may actually have to reprint invitations and send those out. So it's going to cost a lot of money to move a wedding, more than just the facility fee. And so therefore, in traditional project management or Waterfall project management, you need to map out all of your dependencies. You have to understand everything that depends on other things. Stakeholders, people who have an influence on your project or who are influenced by your project, are generally only involved as needed. Now, we're going to study what as needed means a little bit later. But for example, in the United States, in a traditional wedding, the mother of the groom is a stakeholder. and may pay for the reception dinner. But she wouldn't be involved in picking out invitations. So she's a stakeholder, but she's only really consulted as needed. The use of the term waterfall indicates that you do all the planning ahead of time. You have an initiation stage where you start your project, and then you have a large planning stage where you spend most of the time of your project in planning. And then from that planning stage, everything falls. So it is always kind of depicted this way, and that's why it's called waterfall. You do all the work ahead of time and everything just kind of falls into place. As you execute the project, you control how it goes. And then it's always very important in every aspect of project management that you close out a project. That is an important part of project management. You review how it went, gather lessons learned, celebrate your successes, and so on. So I'm going to cover Agile now, but we will come back to Waterfall in a moment. So the other main school of thought in project management is Agile. When people are talking about Agile, you'll also hear terms like Scrum and Kanban. These are kind of specific implementations or tools of Agile. Agile is the overarching term. The main type of project you see this being used in is technology projects, specifically app and software development. In Agile, the project is planned and deployed in stages, and they only plan the project one piece at a time. So if you're familiar with Johnny Cash, I always get in my head the song One Piece at a Time, where he builds a car one piece at a time. And what he winds up with is an awful crazy looking car. But this always brings it up. That's not the case in Agile project management because it's purposeful. In the initiation stage up here, they do high level planning to figure out what all the stages are going to be. And then as they go through the project, they only plan, execute, and deliver one stage at a time. The stakeholders, oops, I'm sorry, I was circling it on my screen, not yours. Here we go. So they do the initiation where they map out the stages, and then they plan, execute, and deliver just one stage at a time. And they go over and over through this plan, execute, and deliver cycle until finally they can kind of close out the project when it is fully complete. So let's look at a couple of examples to understand these a little bit better. So this is a screenshot on the right of the Texas A&M University app, really showing off the power of Agile development. This is an app with a lot of independently operating functions. So they may have had a big vision in the beginning of all the components that they wanted to have in an app, but the developers broke it apart so that they could quickly deliver value to the customer. Maybe the first thing that they deployed was maps. So maybe when you first got the TAMU app, the very first thing when you opened it up on your phone or your iPad was the only thing you saw was maps. And then the team started on the next phase where they delivered the next thing. Perhaps that was notifications so that the campus could send out notifications very widely. Calendar, academic calendar seems like another maybe high priority, but easy to deliver piece. And I imagine something with more advanced functionality like SSO login, where there's going to be considerations of security and password handling and more, that might have taken longer to plan and longer to deliver. So they would have wanted to have a lot of value in the app for the customer before they worked on that bigger piece. Each of those functional pieces is developed and delivered separately. Now, it might have been one team going over and over and over, or they might have had several teams working on different components all at the same time. Agile project management allows for many opportunities for course corrections. So if something is a little different than they expect, it's very easy to change it. A change in one aspect of scope does not always alter the others. For example, if in the maps section of the app, they decided they wanted to send directions, walking directions to a smartwatch, that doesn't affect the academic calendar section of the app. Now, that's not always true. For example, if somebody said, I want the whole thing to be blue and green instead of red and gray, that's going to affect every single piece of the app. So none of these aspects of Agile are universally true, but these are all kind of aspects of a project that make Agile project management a possibility and a really valuable tool to have to manage this type of project. Back to Waterfall. A waterfall project may have parts For example, when you're building a house or a building, it does have separate rooms, but there are too many dependencies in the building as a whole to break it up and build the building room by room. For example, if you're installing electrical, which we can see here, these little blue boxes attached to the framing of this building, electrical all has to be run throughout the home while it's being framed so that it can all get connected to the main box without having to punch a bunch of holes in the drywall or the sheetrock. So it needs to be run before walls are put up, but after framing is done. There are dependencies. Being able to run electricity depends on these factors. A change later in the project of a waterfall project has a bigger risk to time and cost than changes early in the project. For example, if you added a room onto a home, if you added it onto the plans before you even started pouring the foundation, that's fine. It is going to cost more money, but it's not a massive risk. But if you're already done with the house and then say you want to add another room, that's a whole other issue. All of the people in building equipment and things that did site preparation, foundation pouring, electrical, plumbing, they've all left, and it's going to cost a lot more money and a lot more time to get them back to add another room. So you don't usually get to pick which project management method you use. You can use Agile if your project can be broken up into parts and does not have a lot of dependencies, but otherwise you really do have to use Waterfall and do all that planning ahead of time. If you have a lot of dependencies, you really need to do your planning up front. Not all data science projects are the same though. So if you're conducting a meta-analysis in public health, for example, that is a very highly standardized field. They require everything to be planned and published in a protocol before you embark on data collection at all. So that has to be done with waterfall methodology. But if you're doing some exploratory data analysis in UFO sightings in Texas, I teach another class where I love to use the UFO sightings database as a sample data set. So if you're doing exploratory data analysis on UFO sightings and all you have are just some initial research questions to start with, then considering agile approaches makes a lot of sense. But at the same time, there's always going to be some dependencies. You might need to decide on your full metadata scheme ahead of time, for example. So choosing waterfall method would allow you to map those dependencies out ahead of time. The downfall to waterfall, of course, is that it's less flexible to change. In Agile, you can achieve value early on. For example, if you're doing a longitudinal study, you can publish some initial findings and continue to work on that longitudinal study in those Agile phases or stages. In that case, it might make more sense to use Agile. But the downfall to Agile for data science is that failure to plan ahead risks harking. If you're not aware, harking stands for hypothesizing after results are known. And it's considered in many fields to be an incident of research misconduct. So you do want to do a little bit of discussion with advisors and mentors if any of this is a question for you in your discipline. A hot tip, the library has really wonderful workshops on data management and research integrity. If some of the terms that I've used, such as metadata schemes, data management, or research misconduct are new to you. So both areas of project management do use the same broad knowledge areas that you can learn in though. You just apply them differently in each of the two methodologies. And one of the great benefits of learning the discipline of project management is learning how and where to look for guidance on specific issues. So as I started us out, one of the things that I want to do is give you the vocabulary so that you can kind of go off and independently learn more on your own in the areas that you're curious about. This is an image, by the way, of the PMBOK. I told you that's what we call it, or the Project Management Body of Knowledge. This is the 6th edition. And in all of the editions of the PMBOK, they separate the discipline of project management into 10 knowledge areas. And those are integration, that is integrating all the parts of a project together. Scope, time, and cost. Remember, those 3 are the definition of a project, the triple constraint, as well as quality, human resources, communication, risk and risk management, procurement, and stakeholders. So we're going to take one area together as a big group. we're going to do time. So each one of those 10 knowledge areas has specific processes that you can learn about in project management. So for example, when you dive in on time, you learn that there are at least 7 processes around the topic of time in project management. Planning how to manage your schedule, defining all your activities, sequencing those, estimating the activity resources that you'll need, estimating durations of each activity, developing your full schedule, and controlling your schedule. Believe it or not, in many fields, being a project scheduler is a career field on its own. And in fact, there are certifications that you can get as a project scheduler. Each one of these 10 knowledge areas is really a career field on its own in the discipline of project management. And there's a whole lot that you can learn from them. So we're going to dive in to one of these processes, and that is define project activities. I just want to give you a taste of what you can find if you decide to learn a little bit more about a specific area of project management. So remember, there were 10 knowledge areas, each with its own set of processes, and each of those processes has a chart like this. When you are conducting this process, which was, we chose the one define project activities, what inputs do you need to do this? What tools and techniques can you learn to make the process easier, and what outputs do you get from it? So I've actually blacked out inputs and outputs so that we can focus on the tools and techniques, because to me, that's the fun stuff to learn. So we're going to get a taste by just taking a look at what they mean by the decomposition tool in defining your project activities, because I think this is a helpful skill to learn. It's also sort of intuitive. So here's a quick sample of decomposition. And this is, I told you, some of the data science that I might do in my work, very simplistic data science. It's just analyzing my annual statistics, gathering all the data about all the work that I do. So you start out decomposition. I'm just decomposing the work I need to do by listing the deliverables. So these are the things that I need to produce as part of this data science project. And that is, I need to study my program's effectiveness. I need to write our annual report. I need to do my own self-evaluation. And I also need to write up the SACS outcomes for the library. That's our accreditation outcomes. So I chose to do decomposition sample just on one of these. So each one of these you would break apart further. You would just decompose it further into what work needs to be done. In this case, library SACS outcomes, I need to do both instruction and resource outcomes. And so I work in instruction. So I'm going to further break that one down. Instruction outcomes can be broken down, not really into more deliverables, because it's really just one deliverable, but the steps in that process are gathering data, cleaning the data, developing the report. Again, each one of those would be broken down if they need to be. I'm just going to break down developing a report. I need to go grab the templates from where they're at, find last year's data. I need to analyze this year's data. I need to develop the right charts, and I need to write a report for our stakeholders. And then as I break that down even more, I need to write it up and then email it. And then at some point, it feels like I'm possibly getting a little too much detail. At some point, it gets to be a little bit silly to keep breaking things down. I don't need to describe how to write an email, for example. The point at which you stop breaking down project activities is very subjective to you. They say that you should do it when you reach a unit of work. Again, very subjective. There are some people that say about 8 hours of work for one person, you can call that a unit of work. So if it's just a day's work or less for just one person, you can stop decomposing. But if you've got multiple people to assign something to, maybe continue breaking it down. And once you have every part of a project broken down into these units of work, this becomes a very well-defined project. I mean, imagine that I did that for every element of each of my deliverables, and I have very much defined the activities of the project that I need to do. And I showed you this process of decomposition to give you a taste of the kind of tools that you can get when you study project management. It is fairly intuitive, right? But project managers take this a step further. So I'm just going to go back to this sample knowledge area and the processes that they get. After breaking it all down, we would go back to this list of processes because we finished this one, define all project activities. And then we move on to sequencing those activities, putting them in some kind of order, estimating what resources I would need if there's any cost or other types of resources needed for activities, estimating their durations. I would develop a schedule, and then I would figure out how to control it, often by assigning it in some sort of technology that would notify people when it's due, things like that. There's lots of different ways to control a schedule. So that was just our sample knowledge area of time. So next, our original plan was to break out into breakout rooms for you all to choose how to explore one of these other 3 knowledge areas in a breakout group. And that is scope, communication, and stakeholder. We have a little bit more of an intimate group here, so this might be something maybe we just do as one big group. So here's a little bit about these 3 knowledge areas, though, because we are still going to have the links so that people who are viewing the recording later can choose to explore these on their own. So I'm still going to describe all of them. So stakeholders, these are the 3 areas that we're going to explore, or that are possible to explore. What is a stakeholder, and who might your stakeholders be in a data science project? Why is it important to study and understand stakeholders? Next is scope, specifically gathering requirements for your project to discover your scope or elaborate upon your scope. Different types of requirements. Why is it important to classify requirements? And then the last study area or knowledge area is communication, specifically how important it is and how to make a documented plan for communication in a project. And so we have these 3 documents, and if you are viewing the recording later, you're welcome to explore all 3. In each of these are Google Docs. There are 2 to 3 links. There's at least 1 video. So if you prefer to learn by video, there's at least 1 of those, and there's at least 1 document. So if you prefer to learn by text, you have that opportunity as well. It's 5 minutes or less of content. So the videos are all 5 minutes or less. And then the text is all, I think 5 minutes of reading was 900 words. They're all 900 words or less. So the idea is to spend about 5 minutes reviewing 1 piece of content. And there's some starter questions to include for prompts. And then we'll come back together and share something we learned from the material. So since we have a more intimate group in the live session, why don't you all just choose on your own right now, instead of us moving into groups? Let's just do it here in the big group. Choose one of these 3 areas on your own to click on. And then within that area, choose something to learn from, the video or the text resources that are in there. So stakeholder, scope, or communication, choose whatever you like. I'm going to pause the recording because we're going to have about 5 minutes of silence as we do this. And I'll set a timer, and we'll come back after 5 minutes and we'll do the questions together. Okay, so we took about 5 minutes to review a resource on one of these issues and to consider some applications to projects either in our personal life or data science. Is anybody okay with sharing what they studied?
I think I can get started.
Awesome, thank you.
Sure. So I looked into the communication plan, and actually it's very, very relevant to a couple of projects I'm currently working on. One of the key things is to get the stakeholders together and synchronize the message across the whole project. So that's exactly what the communication plan is about, is trying to figure out a plan to share the information and synchronize across the team. And also something I missed actually after learning a bit more on the website is that instead of just worrying about internal communication, you just think about how to reach out to outside, to stakeholders. So that's something a lot of research projects that I have been involved in, I think this either missed or not doing very well, mainly because we are mostly research focused, and we're focused on our papers, our development status. We didn't get out and talk with the stakeholders as needed. That's what my feeling is. So I think in the future I'll be more than happy just to reach out to people and get their feedback as soon as possible. That's something I need to do. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I have kind of a, I have kind of a story around that. I was once part of a project that was really, really successful, actually. And I was really happy with how it was going. We were ahead of schedule. We had a really productive team. Everybody knew their roles. It was all very outlined. We were developing a service for, it was a different institution, not this one. And at some point, one of our biggest stakeholders came to me through my boss. So they went to my boss and said, how come we haven't heard anything about this project? Why are y'all so behind? And it was a fairly small project. And so I didn't think I needed to develop a communication plan. I thought everybody would just take their roles and do the communication that in my mind aligned with their roles, but there was just someone on the team who couldn't read my mind and didn't know that I expected them to be providing updates to that person. And so even in a small project, discussing communication purposefully and explicitly is really important. Yeah, and external, just like what you just said. So yeah, that was a big lesson learned on even a very successful and an otherwise successful project. Guess it depends on how you define success.
Sure. Great. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else feel free to share?
Yeah, I can share. Okay, yeah, so I was looking at the stakeholder identification videos. I look at the second video, how to identify stakeholders in project management. So it's talking about who count as stakeholders. So stakeholders are anyone who have an interest in your project or the outcomes of your project. So sponsors, team members are the stakeholders we usually think of. But customers or users of the end product, they're also stakeholders. Media. So okay, so that speaks to the first question. How can you classify stakeholders? I think the definition of stakeholders help us classify who are the stakeholders. Think of a personal project. Okay, a data science project at A&M. Who are some of my stakeholders? So collaborators, funding agencies, professors and students who are working on the project are the stakeholders. If you have a Twitter audience and you're okay to share, then they're also stakeholders. Okay, so why is it important to identify the stakeholders? I mean, the key people on the same page about how the project is evolving. And, it's not there. Some of the consequences you already mentioned with communications and stuff. Yeah, so actually know exactly who should be updated about the status of the project will avoid, some of the miscommunication that you guys were mentioning.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing. And you're right. Each of those stakeholders that you mentioned want to know something different about your project, right? Like you talked about your funder. They want to know that you're compliant with their mandates and their policies. Here at A&M, there are different bodies like sponsored research or IT security who also may need to know if you're compliant with their policies. And I like that you pointed out customers and the press. Like sometimes that's a stakeholder that you need to be mindful of. Like if you're doing something that could get really good press, and Gian kind of mentioned this as well, making sure that outside people know the good work that you're doing as well is really good for your career. So cool. Thank you all for sharing. I really appreciate your participation. So just roughly, I'm going to go back to the academic side of project management and show you all kind of roughly what you just went through, right? In identify stakeholders, these are the tools and techniques that you can learn when you study project management as a discipline. You learn how to utilize expert judgment in the formation of your stakeholder register. So that's an output of the process of identifying stakeholders, is creating a register of stakeholders. So I uncovered that over in the outputs, because that's one of the things that you learn about. Doing that through questionnaires and surveys, but you were doing it in a brainstorming format, and they talk a lot about how to do brainstorming as well. And then you were even doing some stakeholder analysis. One of the other resources talk about mapping stakeholders in terms of their interest, like how much they actually care about your project, because some of them might not know anything about it. So, you know, the press doesn't really care about your project. And then what is their influence? But if you're talking about the press, they could have a really high influence, just depending on the type of project you're doing. If they say some researcher at Texas A&M is, I don't know, storing data in an insecure way or something like that, like that's high influence, but low interest. So they talk about mapping stakeholders in one of those resources as well, to figure out how and when you want to communicate with them based on how interested they are or what influence they have over your project. So some cool tools to learn about in stakeholder identification. So nobody chose to learn from scope, but I'll give you kind of a little clue into what you'll learn about in terms of the collecting requirements process of defining your scope in your project. One of the really helpful inputs in this process is the consideration of what they call organizational process assets. And they abbreviate it OPAs. Organizational process assets are, it's really just a reminder to go through your organization and see what assets there already are, what resources, tools, policies, people, and departments already exist to help you with part of your project, right? And so in collecting requirements, some of the assets that exist might be the policies around IT security, if you're doing a data science project, policies around storing data and how you store data, what software already exists on campus is an asset, that's an organizational process asset that you could include as a requirement. So if you have free access to SPSS and free access to learning SPSS, you know, that might be an input into your requirements that you decide that you want to use that software since you have access to it as an asset. And then tools and techniques, some of the ones that are talked about in the links are analyzing existing documents, affinity diagrams or mind mapping. So kind of mind mapping out the requirements for your project. What are your research questions? If you're doing a data science project, what research questions are you working on and how do they relate to each other? Using interpersonal and team skills to discuss requirements as well. There's a lot of talk about meeting facilitation in project management that you can learn a lot from. And then communications management. This is the one that Gian studied. And some of the tools and techniques are communication requirements analysis. There was a cool tool that showed what a project communication plan can look like. You know, you could create a table where you have who is this stakeholder, what do they need to know about, how often do they need to be informed about it, in what form is the communication going to take, who is the owner of this communication, et cetera. And so that's called a communication requirements analysis, and the output of that can be your communications management plan. Another really cool input into this process is that stakeholder analysis that I talked about when we were talking about identifying stakeholders. So if you've got a low interest but high influence person, you still want to keep them informed, even though they don't really care about your project. If they could immediately stop your project by their influence, you do want to make sure you keep them informed in some way. So yeah, understanding stakeholder engagement is definitely related to creating that communication plan. So we have reached the end of our content for today. And so I want to kind of briefly cover what we've learned. Project management can be done ad hoc, right? A lot of the things that we've talked about today are fairly intuitive, but there's a lot of great benefit in purposefully learning these as a discipline and in planning out your project purposefully. And understanding the two different arms of methodology of project management, Waterfall and Agile, and when to use each can really help you choose that purposeful planning method. I would love for you all to review the 10 knowledge areas and dive deeper into the ones where you think learning the processes and methods would be really helpful to projects that you work on. And my last slide, we'll send this out to attendees, or you can just use the links that you see here, is a roadmap for learning project management. Texas A&M University has an institutional account to LinkedIn Learning. LinkedIn Learning has a wide variety of professional development courses, and there are hundreds in project management and Agile from a wide variety of methodologies and viewpoints, but really well presented. I really love learning myself from LinkedIn Learning. Projectmanagement.com is owned and run by PMI, that's Project Management Institute. It's important to know that it is a professional association, and so there is a lot of really great free content, but it is also a publisher. So there is also paid content as well. So there's kind of both sides. So as long as you're aware of that, you can direct your search to the free content so that you don't run into a paywall. And then the two main bodies of scholarship that I would recommend are the Guide to the Project Management Body of Knowledge, or as we refer to it, the PMBOK. I prefer the 6th edition. There are 7 editions now. The 7th edition is a much briefer edition. They rely more on somebody going out to learn on their own, but the 6th edition is still really comprehensive. So I like the 6th edition. And then the Agile Practice Guide is PMI's version of Agile. Agile is not a trademarked term. So there are a whole lot of places where you can go and learn about Agile. This is one that I would recommend because it'll really complement the learning we did today and anything that you learn in project management. And so that's the end of my content. So I am here for any questions that you all have. I'll go ahead and stop the recording so that the questions don't have to be on the recording.